Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, July 24th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The West knew that Ukraine was not ready for its counteroffensive. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Saturday that Western officials knew Ukrainian forces did not have enough training or equipment, but hoped that they would be able to break through anyway in their counteroffensive. So I just have to read this excerpt from the Wall Street Journal report because it's just really something. It reads, quote, "When Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces, but they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. They haven't," end quote. So it's really saying a lot. And leading up to the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which was launched in early June, the Discord leaks and media reports revealed that the U.S. did not believe Ukraine could regain much territory from Russia, and here's more evidence that that was the case. But the Biden administration did not care. They pushed for the assault anyway, and they rejected the idea of a pause in fighting or a ceasefire or any kind of diplomacy. No, they just wanted to throw Ukrainians into this fight. And Ukrainian forces have struggled to push through Russia's defenses, which includes vast minefields, resulting in heavy Ukrainian armor losses in the first few weeks of the counteroffensive. As I went over last week, U.S. officials speaking to the New York Times and the Washington Post have blamed the lack of success on Ukraine's tactics, saying that Ukraine is not using the combined armed tactics it learned from NATO countries. But the Wall Street Journal report noted, and this is something that Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, has complained a lot about, is that the U.S. and its Western allies, NATO, they would never launch an offensive like this without air superiority, and Ukraine doesn't have anything close to that. But despite this situation on the battlefield, the U.S. wants Ukraine to try to push harder to break through against Russian forces, regardless of the risk of major casualties. The Wall Street Journal report said that the prospect of a stalemate and a long war would require the U.S. and its allies to provide a huge infusion of sophisticated armaments and more training to give Kiev a chance at victory. So basically saying this thing is, turning into a stalemate, and it could be a very long war, and that, is it sustainable if the U.S. and NATO could support that? We know time is on Russia's side. All right, the next one here. U.S. weapons in Ukraine funneled to arms traffickers and criminals. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And it says that the Pentagon Inspector General found the arms Washington sent to Kiev did not undergo the required inspections. A report from the Inspector General found weapons the U.S. sent to Ukraine in the hands of criminals and on the black market. So the Arms Control Act requires that the White House establish an inspection system for weapons that the U.S. sells or gifts to third countries. And this law mandates the monitoring continues to the end use of the weapon. In Ukraine, the embassy in Kiev has been assigned responsibility for monitoring the weapons transfers. The Department of Defense Inspector General report on American weapons transfers to Ukraine from February to September of last year found that legally required monitoring was not taking place. This report said, quote, "The DoD is unable to conduct end-use monitoring in Ukraine because completing end-use monitoring in accordance with DoD policy requires in-person access to the defense equipment provided. Intelligence methods provide some accountability for observable platforms such as missiles and helicopters, but smaller items such as night vision devices have limited accountability," end quote. So, this is something I'm always worried about, that they could take these oversight concerns and kind of use it as a pretext to, get more involved in the war by sending more, military personnel to Ukraine to conduct inspections of these weapons, which they actually did last year. I believe it was August 2022. The Pentagon announced that there's military personnel in Ukraine conducting on-site inspections, just a few dozen people, but still, it's an example, of mission creep, how the U.S. could be more involved. So in a section of the report that is heavily redacted, the Inspector General listed some cases of American weapons not making it to their intended recipient. The cases that remain unredacted in the report include a Moscow-influenced criminal organization that procured grenade launchers and machine guns. It also included a pro-Kiev militia that tried to sell dozens of rifles on the black market, and a group of arms traffickers who were selling weapons and ammunition stolen from the front lines. In response to questions about the report, a State Department spokesperson admitted that American weapons were being used for illicit purposes in Ukraine. Despite these issues, the spokesperson emphasized that Washington felt the weapons transfers were too important. So basically, their argument is, yeah, we know, these things are happening, but it's just so important that we, arm Ukraine and flood all these weapons into this country. So this State Department spokesperson said, quote, "The U.S. government remains keenly aware of the risk of possible illicit diversion and is proactively taking steps to mitigate this risk in close cooperation with the government of Ukraine. We are realistic that we are sending weapons to help Ukraine defend itself in an active conflict, and there is a risk these weapons could be captured if territory changes hands, which happens in any war," end quote. So earlier this month, the White House came out against a provision in the Pentagon funding bill that would create a special inspector general for Ukraine aid, similar to the position that they had for Afghanistan. The U.S., the White House, the Biden administration, they don't want that, which I think, says a lot. And that Afghan inspector general position was filled by a guy named John Sopko, and he has warned, basically without any oversight, like there's going to be waste, there's going to be corruption, there's going to be skimming, this is all happening. And, if he was in that position, he would likely find lots of examples of that. For years and years, while he was writing up all these reports about the waste and basically how it was impossible for the U.S. to try to, achieve the nation building, what it was trying to do in Afghanistan. And, it didn't really change much, but at least we have, the evidence to look back on. And it's good to know, exactly what the truth is. It's a position like that, establishing some kind of inspector general, I think would get us closer to, knowing what's really happening on the ground in Ukraine when it comes to all these weapons and everything. So, of course, the Biden administration doesn't want that. All right, the next one here. Experts say that demining Ukraine could take hundreds of years. So Ukraine is the most heavily mined country in the world, and demining efforts could take decades or even hundreds of years. This is from a Washington Post report. So a guy named Greg Crowther, he's a director of programs for the Mines Advisory Group, told the Washington Post, quote, "The sheer quantity of ordnance in Ukraine is just unprecedented in the last 30 years. There's nothing like it," end quote. The report said that about 30% of Ukraine, or 67,000 square miles, has been contaminated by mines and other ordnance and will require demining. The area is larger than the U.S. state of Florida, so it's just a huge area that they have to demine and clean up in general. And the situation is going to get a lot worse as the U.S. has provided Ukraine with cluster munitions, which the White House has said Ukrainian forces are already using. And that was part of the excuse to justify it was, they already have to clean up. Why not, add to this mess? Cluster bombs, as we've gone over quite a bit, they spread small submunitions over large areas, and ones that don't explode can kill or maim civilians decades later. So according to UN numbers, between February 2022 and July 2023, so this month, 298 civilians in Ukraine were killed and 632 were injured by mines or other, unexploded ordnance that they came across. And then you have the two different types of mines, the anti-personnel mines, which are most hazardous to civilians because they require less pressure to detonate. If somebody steps on them, they'll explode. And then there is the anti-tank mines, which, require more pressure. But then again, there's plenty of civilian vehicles, I'm sure, like, buses and stuff that could trip them, or even just big SUVs. So Ukraine is a signatory to a treaty banning anti-personnel mines, but there is evidence that Ukrainian forces have used them. The U.S. and Russia are not parties to this treaty, which is known as the Ottawa Treaty. So the U.S. has, added to this mess. They've provided Ukraine with 2 known types of mines, including the remote anti-armor mine system, which uses 155 millimeter artillery and is designed to eventually self-destruct. So it's like a temporary minefield that eventually just blows itself up. So that might not need to be cleaned up, although I'm sure there's some duds in that system. And then the other type of mine is the M21 anti-tank mine, and they do not self-destruct, and they will need to be cleaned up. And Russia has laid very extensive minefields along the front lines, which is a big part of the reason why Ukraine has been struggling to gain much territory in its counteroffensive. And Ukraine is relying on demining soldiers known as sappers to dismantle the minefields by hand, so something that takes a very long time. And this Washington Post report said that some experts estimate clearing all of Ukraine's contaminated areas would take approximately 500 demining teams in the current operation, 757 years to complete. I mean, that's a crazy amount of time. And the mine clearing will also come at a huge financial cost. The World Bank estimates that demining in Ukraine will cost $37.4 billion over the next 10 years. So a really just horrific situation there for Ukraine. So the next one here, White House is rushing to get F-16s to Ukraine by the end of the year. This is another one from Kyle. The Biden administration believes that it is important to get F-16s to the Ukrainian military and estimates the warplanes could arrive at the end of the year, although the White House does not assess the F-16s will alter the course of the war. And we've seen that from quite a few U.S. officials saying, that F-16s aren't going to make much of a difference, essentially. So Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, he said at the Aspen Security Forum that the U.S. is going to push as fast as possible to get the F-16s to Ukraine. So that kind of raises a lot of questions because so far the U.S. has not said it's going to send its own F-16s. They've definitely left that option open, but it's the European countries that are expected to provide their own F-16s, and they're saying, oh, we'll do everything. We'll do the training, but I know the U.S. is going to assist in the training. So how, much more, they might be much more involved than, we've been kind of led to believe in this whole getting F-16s to Ukraine. All right, the next one here. Russia says that Ukraine killed a journalist with cluster bombs. So Russia on Saturday accused Ukrainian forces of killing a Russian journalist in the southern Zaporozhye region using U.S.-provided cluster munitions, which are widely banned due to the harm they cause civilians. So the Russian Defense Ministry said that a reporter for Russia's RIA news agency was killed and 3 other journalists were wounded by a Ukrainian artillery attack. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said that the responsibility for the journalist's death will also be shared by those who have sent cluster munitions, and that's a reference to the United States. So the U.S. has said that Ukraine is already using U.S.-provided cluster munitions, but the Russian claim that cluster bombs killed this one journalist, that's not confirmed. And on Sunday, the Russian Investigative Committee announced that they are investigating the journalist's death, and they did not say that he was killed with cluster munitions. The committee accused Ukrainian forces of purposely firing at a group of Russian journalists, but they did not specifically mention the cluster munitions. I believe it's certainly possible if they're using them. The risk of cluster munitions isn't just them leaving the unexploded, submunitions. It's the fact that they spray these little bombs over pretty large areas. So if there are civilians around, or in this case, a journalist, it could reach, beyond the battle line there. And there have been other reports from Russian and Russian-backed officials about Ukraine using U.S.-provided cluster munitions. A spokesman for law enforcement agencies in Luhansk said on Sunday that Ukrainian forces were using them in attacks on a village. The White House said on July 20th that Ukrainian forces were using cluster munitions quite effectively. In February 2022, the White House said that the use of cluster bombs in Ukraine would potentially be a war crime. So here we are over a year later, and the U.S. is a party to those war crimes. All right, the next one here. Lukashenko claims that Wagner fighters want to go into Poland. So Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko claimed on Sunday that members of the Wagner group who are in Belarus want to go into Poland, comments that come amid heightened tensions between Warsaw and Minsk. So according to the Russian news agency TASS, Lukashenko told Putin that he is, quote, starting to get tense with the Wagner group because they want to march on Warsaw, end quote. So he's basically saying these Wagner guys are saying that they want to go on a tour to Warsaw, into Poland. Not clear if he's saying that they want to invade Poland, attack Poland. It's kind of strange comments, but he said it, to Putin. And these comments came after Poland said that it was sending more troops to eastern Poland in response to Wagner's presence in Belarus. The Belarusian Defense Ministry said on Thursday that Wagner fighters were training Belarusian troops near the Polish border. On Friday, Putin warned Poland that he would treat any attack on Belarus as an attack on Russia. Putin told the Russian Security Council, quote, aggression against Belarus will mean aggression against the Russian Federation. We will respond to it with all means at our disposal, end quote. So Putin also claimed that Poland had its eye on western Ukrainian territory, and he warned that a joint Polish-Lithuanian force could enter Ukraine under the guise of helping protect the country, but saying ultimately that they would want to occupy the Ukrainian territory. So tensions are pretty high right now between Poland, Belarus, Russia. And we'll see how this all unfolds. But I just want to take this moment to mention our sponsor for today. This show is sponsored by the Expat Money Summit, which is a pretty interesting event hosted by Mikkel Thorup. He's the head of Expat Money, and it's basically an online conference, explaining how certain useful skills for people who are living outside of their country. And it's very interesting. I actually talked to Mikkel. He's a listener of the show, and he had me on his podcast recently, the Expat Money podcast. And one interesting topic that we discussed was where in the world could people live where you have the best chance of being spared violence if say a world war does break out. I think we landed on Latin America, South America, Central America. When you think about it, all those countries aren't really aligned. But go check out that conversation. That's on his podcast. But some of the things that you could learn at this summit, if you're interested, is residences and citizenships. You can discover countless ways to obtain secondary residences and citizenships so you can pack up and leave whenever you want. Wealth protection and tax planning. Discover how you can legally and easily reduce your tax bill and ensure that your wealth will be protected from greedy governments and incompetent banks forever. And now that's an important one, for us, because the less taxes you pay to a government, the less your money is going to fund wars. I mean, that's one of the worst things about living in the United States is all that federal tax that they take from you. How much of that goes to, funding the war machine. And at this summit, there's a lot of great speakers, including Peter Schiff, Mark Faber, Ron Paul, who all of you know Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Jim Rogers. So a lot of really interesting people. And it's going to be held on October 2nd to October 6th. And it's free, but you have to reserve your free ticket. Just put in your email here, and there's a link in the description and the show notes. So go check that out. Again, Mikkel is a listener of the show, and they're sponsoring us now. So please go register if you're interested in freedom and things like that. I think you'll really get a lot out of it. And also listen to our conversation. All right, back to the news now. Where were we here? The next one, after hospital, Netanyahu to attend judicial reform vote. So Netanyahu was in and out of the hospital a few times, and he's out, and he's saying he's going to attend. The Knesset is scheduled to vote on this very controversial judicial overhaul on Monday. So this article is from Middle East Eye. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he would still attend a key judicial reform vote on Monday, despite having an unscheduled pacemaker implanted in him overnight Saturday. Netanyahu said that he was doing excellently after the operation and plans to jump right back into the work of overhauling Supreme Court powers that has brought nationwide protests to a boil and stirred calls for compromise. With the country ensnared in its worst domestic crisis in decades, President Isaac Herzog on Sunday met Netanyahu in the hospital in hope of closing the rifts between the religious nationalist ruling coalition and opposition parties. So Monday is going to be a big day in Israel. There's been huge protests, and all sorts of people, the military peoples, are very against this, and reservists saying that they won't serve if they pass this. So we'll see how the vote is. Netanyahu and his coalition seem pretty determined to push this thing through, but it's really causing a lot of unrest inside Israel. So we'll see how it all plays out. All right, the next one here, the U.S. and Australia launched their largest ever joint military exercises. So the U.S. and Australia on Friday launched the largest ever iteration of their Talisman Sabre exercise, as the U.S. is increasingly focused on building alliances in the Asia-Pacific against China. The Talisman Sabre started in 2005 as a biennial exercise between the U.S. and Australia. This year's iteration involves participants from 11 other countries and over 30,000 military personnel. U.S. Navy Secretary General Carlos del Toro spoke at the opening ceremony on Friday and said the massive drills served as a warning to China. He said, quote, "The most important message that China can take from this exercise, and anything that our allies and partners do together, is that we are extremely tied by the core values that exist among our many nations together," end quote. So again, this is the big part of the U.S. strategy, is building alliances against China. That's what it's all about. So in a symbolic gesture to demonstrate the growing military ties between the U.S. and Australia, on Saturday, the U.S. commissioned a naval vessel in Sydney, the USS Canberra, which is an Independence-class littoral combat ship. And this marked the first time ever that the U.S. commissioned a Navy vessel in a foreign port. So kind of a strange thing, and showing, I think, how much importance the U.S. is putting on Australia. So Del Toro has previously said that the U.S. Navy envisions turning Australia into a full-service submarine hub for the U.S. and its allies in the region under the AUKUS military pact that was signed between the U.S., Britain, and Australia in 2021. And that's going to result eventually in Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. So the U.S. and Australia were joined in these Talisman Sabre exercises by the militaries of Fiji, France, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Britain, Canada, and Germany. So it's quite a few countries. And personnel from the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand are also attending as observers. So the exercises involve live fire drills all over Australia, out at sea, and they will conclude on August 4th. A Chinese naval vessel was spotted surveilling the drills, which Australian military officials said has happened since 2017. So a big show of force, and I feel like I'm always saying these are the largest ever drills, largest ever. It's just huge military exercises that have been going on all over the world. All right, the next one here, the U.S. is sending Marines and warships to the Middle East over Iran tensions. So U.S. Central Command announced on July 20th that the U.S. was deploying a Marines Corps unit and additional warships to the Middle East amid heightened tensions with Iran. So the command said in a press release that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin ordered the deployment of an amphibious readiness group / Marine Expeditionary Unit, which typically consists of about 2,200 Marines and 3 amphibious warships. So it's pretty decent-sized force. And CENTCOM said that the deployment was ordered in response to recent attempts by Iran to seize commercial ships. So Iran seized 2 vessels in the Persian Gulf region after the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil in the region in April. So it was the U.S. seizing that ship, forcing this tanker to go to the U.S. that really sparked this latest, whatever, if you want to call it a tanker war, whatever you want to call it. And since then, the U.S. has announced, it's conducting more patrols in the Persian Gulf and sending more military assets to the region. They just recently sent F-16s and other fighter jets, again, in the name of this protecting these ships from Iran. And they also sent a guided missile destroyer. So the U.S., I covered this last week, the Suez Rajan is the name of the U.S. seized ship, the ship that the U.S. seized. I don't want you to think it's a U.S. ship, but right now it's still off the coast of Texas, and it's struggling to unload its cargo, which is Iranian oil, because American companies are fearful that if they take the oil, then Iran might retaliate in the Persian Gulf by, seizing one of their tankers. So it's kind of an interesting situation. All right, the last one here is an article from NPR. The U.S. dismissed evidence of civilian deaths in Baghdadi raid. So this is the second time in recent weeks that we're running an article from NPR. It's definitely a rare occurrence, but so this is interesting. Confidential documents obtained by NPR provide new details about one of the most celebrated U.S. military operations in recent history and reveals flaws in the Pentagon's claim that deadly airstrikes did not hit civilians. So this was in 2019 that U.S. Special Operations Forces raided the Syrian hideout of ISIS founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leading him to blow himself up. Then President Donald Trump called the raid impeccable, and military officials said that troops protected non-combatants. The Defense Department dismissed the accounts reported by NPR of U.S. helicopter fire killing and maiming Syrian civilians during the raid. The Pentagon said those men were enemy combatants who ignored warning shots. So NPR sued the Pentagon under the Freedom of Information Act to release documentation of the airstrike, and it obtained a redacted copy of the Defense Department's confidential 2020 report on the incident. The report was originally classified as secret with no foreign distribution. NPR's review of the document, including aerial imagery from the operation, finds that U.S. troops fired warning shots mere seconds before launching airstrikes on the Syrian men's van. This undermines the military's assertion that the men demonstrated hostility by failing to stop or change course. The Pentagon provided no evidence that the victims were enemy combatants, but beyond the split-second assessment by U.S. troops on the dark night of the raid, U.S. officials did not compile an intelligence dossier as recommended in the report. The Pentagon questioned the veracity of accounts given to NPR by the airstrike survivor and families of the victims, but it did not contact their survivor or conduct a full formal investigation. So it got these reports that they might have killed civilians, and they didn't do any kind of follow-up investigation, which is not surprising because the Pentagon, this is pretty typical of the Pentagon. And they also, the NPR spoke with the Syrian survivor. So it was one man that survived these airstrikes that was killed with two friends that he was with. So two of them were killed. One guy survived. He lost his arm. And he is saying that NPR, him and his two friends were working as agricultural laborers, and they were driving him home. And the Pentagon story is that they were militants unaffiliated with ISIS, which kind of doesn't make sense. Why would militants unaffiliated with ISIS try to engage with these U.S. troops if they think that they're raiding al-Baghdadi? And this guy's saying they didn't know that he was hiding out there. But it's just another case of how the Pentagon handles civilian casualties. They're not afraid to lie about it or just try to sweep it under the rug. That's it for our news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Brian Clark. If Ukraine joins NATO, does the U.S. know what it's bargaining for? We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter. The FBI serves as a conduit for Ukraine's censorship campaign. One from Daniel Larison. War with China over Taiwan. Don't expect U.S. allies to join. That's over at Responsible Statecraft. One from Peter Jacobson. The Folly of America's Empire. That's over at FEE. And our spotlight is from Greg Mitchell over at his Substack, Oppenheimer. Does Hollywood fear the truth about the A-bomb? And speaking of Oppenheimer, or if you go over the blog, The Truth About Oppenheimer, this is a documentary series from my friend Pat McFarlane of the Libertarian Institute. It's at his YouTube channel, which is Vital Dissent. And this is part one. It's about a half hour long, and it's about Oppenheimer. It's really interesting documentary series that he's starting here, and it focuses on how the Manhattan Project scientists injected Americans with lethal doses of plutonium without them knowing about it. Really cruel, sick stuff that they were doing. And I haven't seen the Oppenheimer film yet. I do have to watch it, but I'm sure that they, I doubt that they got into that aspect of it. So go check that out. But that's everything for me for today. Hope everybody had a good weekend. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Share the show. If you listen to the podcast, which most of you do, you could leave a review wherever you listen to it. Follow us on Twitter. All that stuff helps. But I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.